Welcome, those of you who have already joined us. So my name's Brian Kreider. I am the Regional Sales Manager for Fermentis for Central North America. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Jose Pizarro, who covers, is also a sales manager for the Eastern U.S. and Gulf Coast, Eastern North America and Gulf Coast states of the U.S. So, the plan is to watch a short video presentation on the SafBrew LA01 for low and no alcohol beer. It's a kind of an abbreviated presentation of a longer one that we sometimes do, but the idea is to play this presentation and just kind of get the conversation started, and then after the video we'll have a little time for a question and answer session. If you're joining us by a computer, I can activate your sound after the video, and you can ask questions that way. Otherwise, feel free to type in any questions in the chat window on the right side of your screen as well. So whatever you're comfortable with. So. Okay, well, without any further delay, I'll go ahead and play the presentation video. And I think the video is maybe about 10 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A after that. Here we go.
So today I'd like to talk about a new product from Fermentis. It's in our SafBrew. It's in our SafBrew category portfolio. It's called SafBrew LA01. This strain is intended for low or non-alcoholic beers, just with fermentation. So this is a Saccharomyces cerevisiae variety Chevalieri strain that we selected for the fermentation characteristics, but also for the aromatic fractions, the flavor profile, representing really what is typical of beer fermentation characteristics. So first, I'll start with just describing the microorganism, what we intended to do from the beginning. So for a lower non-alcoholic beer, you want the strain to be maltose negative. Again, to present that aromatic fraction that's similar or the same as what you would normally expect in a beer. And then with this initial introduction into this NA category, we were looking for a low phenol expression coming from the yeast. In terms of the alcohol production, based on a standard mash regime, you're going to end up with a typical sugar concentration of 10 to 15% glucose, 50 to 60% maltose, 10 to 20% maltotriose, and then 15 to 20% dextrins beyond that. With the selection of this Chevalieri strain, we were looking to find a strain that only ferments the simple sugars, in this case just glucose or potentially fructose, but only to ferment that 10 to 15% concentration of sugar in the wort when you're following a standard mash regime. In terms of the fermentations that we performed, here's 4 examples of kinetics from just using this strain. The fermentation limit, attenuation limit was reached 60 to 75 hours into fermentation. You can see really the difference between 6, 8, 10, and 15 Plato, and how fast that is, and what the alcohol percentage was that was achieved. For the NA production in North America and in most parts of the world, the limit is 0.5% alcohol. So in order to target that percentage of alcohol, we recommend that you're somewhere between 7 and 8 Plato, which will give you right about that 0.5% alcohol production. Again, that's with a standard mash. You can adjust the mash by hitting different temperatures for your mash in, and extracting different carbohydrate profiles. But for a standardized mash, for a standardized carb profile, you're looking at roughly 7 to 8 Plato to hit that 0.5% alcohol. Additionally, with this strain, we wanted to achieve somewhere around 10 to 15% attenuation. And again, in all 4 of these scenarios, all of these trials, the ADF was 13 to 14%. And again, in that 7 to 8 Plato range where you're going to have the 0.5% alcohol, you're right at about 13, maybe 13.5% attenuation. What's interesting with this strain was really the complexity of the beer that was produced. Even with only that 10 to 15% attenuation, you're really having a complex media, complex fermentation flavor produced, where you do have some compounds that are being produced that are above the threshold value. For example, acetaldehyde here at 8 Plato is above threshold.
Hi, I just paused the video because I got a message here saying the video is buffering. I don't know if everybody's having that experience or Jose, I don't know if it was working on your end. I just want to make sure everybody's able to see it. So I just paused. You're muted, Jose, so if you're Jose, you're still muted. If somebody can type in, I don't know if just type in whether you were able to see the video or if you were having issues as well. Okay, I'm going to play it again and see what happens.
But you're also having a complex mixture of other fermentation flavors, isomer alcohol, isobutanol, diacetyl, all being below threshold. But because of them being present, their synergies actually give the flavor of beer, even if they're not above threshold value. Additionally, the strain is pH positive, but because it's a small 10 to 15% attenuation, it's not an expression of phenolics as you would expect from Hefeweizen or Belgian style beer, but more just complexity adding to the beer. Additionally, we did do some fermentations colder to see if it was possible to limit the production of volatile compounds, kind of to slow down the yeast and have more lager-like fermentation, which it was successful, but really we recommend to ferment above 10 degrees C just because it shows a very slow fermentation with a potential risk of non-complete fermentation of those simple sugars when you're at 10 degrees. But there were really no significant aromatic differences. There wasn't off flavor produced when we were at cooler temperatures. In terms of the experimental trials we did, really the first conclusions that we can make about SafBrew LA01 is that it produces well-balanced beers that have a slight phenol character to them, but without defect. The fermentations are preferably above 10 degrees C. The fermentations are successful at 10 C, but it's slower and could potentially have the risk of unfermented simple sugars. Contains simple sugars, contains residual sugars in the resulting beer, which makes the beer quite fragile in terms of potential contaminations in the brewery. So for that reason, we strongly recommend, we insist that the beer.
I'm going to pause just for a second again to see if I can remedy the issue. It might be that I'm logged in as the owner and an administrator at the same time. So let's see what's going on.
Beer be pasteurized in the package. Fermentis' standpoint on that is very strong, that we say it's mandatory to pasteurize the beer in the package. And that's for your safety, your brewery workers' safety, for the distribution network and for the consumer's safety. Really, the ending conclusions to the SafBrew LA01 is that the pitching rate is 50 grams per hectoliter, a fairly wide range for temperature, 15 up to 25 C. With that, with a standard mashing regime, you will have an apparent degree of fermentation around 15, maybe 13 up to 15%. The alcohol produced will be 0.5% ABV for 7 to 8 Plato, somewhere in that range, with a pH of the beer being around 4.5. This strain, again, is a Chevalier, produces no off flavors. It is P-off positive, but usually that's just more of a complexity to the beer than something that's truly recognizable as phenol. With it, we do recommend a pasteurization of 50 up to 100 pasteurization units. We've done some studies on that and found that 50 PU is the minimum that we would want, or that you would want, to make sure that the beer is stable. With SafBrew LA01, we do not recommend repitching because of this being a fragile beer in the end. So anytime that you can avoid repitching is for sure beneficial, and obviously this no re-fermentation for bottles, because that just creates even more potential introduction of a different microorganism. Thank you for watching this video. Discover more about SafBrew LA01 by visiting our WBC virtual booth or downloading our app and following us on social networks. Thank you.
Okay, so hopefully that sound wasn't too terrible and that it improved there towards the end. But hopefully you were able to get something out of the slides. I see that Lucky already has a question here about the apparent degrees of fermentation. Yes, indeed. That's kind of the whole idea with choosing this strain, that it's only fermenting the glucose, sucrose, and fructose in the beer. So starting with a wort of, say, 8 or 9 Plato, and say 10 to 15 degrees of fermentation, you end up with about 0.5% alcohol. And then what you end up with by starting at that lower degree Plato, you may end up with, 6 Plato in the final beer. But with the remaining sugars being maltose and maltotriose, the beers generally do not taste overly sweet. They actually will taste very much like a traditionally fermented beer with a typical Saccharomyces strain. But the idea is to be able to produce a non-alcoholic beer through fermentation only. So I don't know if that answers your question. I guess the other part of it is stability, and that's a very good question. Virtually any other microorganism, whether it's your house yeast strain, another microbe, a bacteria, whatever, anything in this beer will be happy to consume that maltose. So, as you saw in the presentation, maltose is typically 60, 70% of the extract in a wort. So when using LA01, once all the glucose, fructose, sucrose is consumed, it can no longer ferment, but if there's another organism present, it can easily take over. So what's really important is any beers produced with this strain must be pasteurized in the package, batch pasteurized. Flash pasteurization prior to packaging may offer some amount of protection, but it doesn't protect from any kind of contamination that could happen during packaging. So it really is mandatory that anything be pasteurized with this product. Another thing to keep in mind is the amount of time you leave a beer in a tank. The fermentation is going to be much shorter. So typically you're going to reach final attenuation in about 2 days. And once that attenuation is reached, it would be good practice to go ahead and cold crash that beer, get it off the yeast, and process it. Because if it's allowed to sit in the tank for a prolonged period of time and there's another organism present, let's say it's just your house yeast strain, and there's just a very low level contamination, a few yeast strains. It's basically sitting in a yeast starter of maltose. So it would be able to grow and multiply and continue attenuating that beer. Kind of the same thing if you're planning on dry hopping. So a beer produced with this strain, you dry hop, but you need to think about the timing of that and the strategy used with that a little bit differently. Perhaps you're going to be dry hopping at the beginning of fermentation on day 1 or day 2, and then processing the beer as soon as it's attenuated to avoid any amylolytic enzyme activity or anything following that. Another option would be to use hop extracts if you're looking to get some dry hop character in the beer. Luckily, hopefully answered your question. Feel free to add additional comments. I know that both Jose and I have tried beers with this. To me, I've had a variety of different low and no alcohol beers. And beers brewed with LA01 taste more like a typical beer to me. If, for lack of a better term, they taste more beer-like than some of the non-alcoholic beers that have been on the market in past decades. I don't know. I might be able to just activate participants if we want to just discuss things, but I don't want to mess up our bandwidth and have issues if we do that. So. Well, glad you liked the presentation, Lucky. But yeah, I think a lot of times people also have a question as far as drinkability. Could you, go to a much higher degree Plato starting gravity and then, make a low alcohol barley wine or something like that, lower than it would typically be. And I think the answer to that is it probably would not be ideal, because once you're going to go past maybe 12, maybe 14 Plato, I really can't say, you will end up with a high amount of residual sweetness and the beer may not be particularly drinkable. But it is possible to make, a 0.5% alcohol or also 1.5 or 2% alcohol beer. So. Yeah, Tammy, so to answer your question, it's a very new product. We have some large, across the world, some large industrial and regional breweries that are currently conducting trials with it. Widely to say that, but the feedback has been very good so far. We can't tell you which breweries are currently trialing it, but the feedback has been great so far. But like I was saying earlier, the key is paying attention to sanitation, just to avoid any potential pitfalls. Because you can imagine if, a safety issue with just a typically produced beer, a small amount of residual sugar going into the package, and a contaminant can potentially cause additional fermentation and overcarbonation in the package. Well, with this beer, virtually all of the remaining extract, so maybe 60, 70% of the remaining extract, will be fermentable by other organisms. So if that happens in a package, you could literally overnight have overcarbonation and additional alcohol production. And additional alcohol production could potentially lead to a regulatory violation. So again, using the strain, you really have to be thinking about safety and sanitation, and then batch pasteurizing. Not a lot of small craft brewers have that the ability to batch pasteurize in an easy way. But if you think about it, every brewery has hot water. So, if you want to you're a nano brewery and you want to play around with this, there are ways to pasteurize a product with using hot water in your brewery. It may not be easy, but it's an option. But flavor with this has been very nice. I've had several beers brewed with it and enjoy it very much. That's a good question, Tammy. I think the answer is both. It can be on draft or in bottles. But again, typically you're not pasteurizing in a keg. So I think a lot of the larger industrial breweries are going to be sanitizing the kegs with steam and then filling pasteurized beer into that. And then anybody that's bottling would either be using a tunnel pasteurizer, or there are also small, like skid mounted pasteurizers that can do just a few cases at a time. But I would say most of the time, majority of this is probably going to be can or bottle. But kegging is an option too, but I would say that it's probably going to be the breweries using steam. So there's a question here. Oh, Tammy says that they might have lost me. Hopefully I'm back. The cost for a sample of yeast, I think it kind of depends on what market you're in. If you can just post what country you're in, we could potentially connect you with a sales rep that could help you out with that. Hopefully I pronounce your name correctly, Daneshwar. What country are you in so we can connect you with a rep? Guyana. Okay, cool. I'll write down your name and see if I can connect you with somebody. Great. Okay, the beer will not taste like water. No, the beers I've had have not tasted like water. They've actually been very full flavored. So the LA01 yeast is actually, per degree of fermentation produces a lot of flavor compounds. But the fact that there's only a small amount of fermentation happening at 10 to 15%, the total amount of those fermentation byproducts and flavor compounds are very similar to what you would have in a typical ale or lager fermentation. So it produces a lot of flavor in that short period of time. So, that way you get the taste of a typical beer. I don't know if that's a good way to answer that question. I have seen brewers that started with a much lower gravity than that, and I haven't had the opportunity to taste, starting at like 4 Plato, and I haven't really had an opportunity to taste those beers. But those would be very low alcohol. But in my experience, they've been very full flavored. And we've also played around with fermenting at different temperatures too. And, some of the beers that I've tasted fermented at lower temperatures had a very lager-like flavor as well. I've also talked to a couple brewers who have used this strain and then also actually done a kettle sour using SafSour LP 652 and then fermented the beer with LA01 to produce a low alcohol kettle sour beer, which is a very interesting concept as well. But the same thing would apply, that mandatory to pasteurize that product. So there are a lot of different strategies out there for producing low alcohol beers, de-alkalizing systems, a wide variety. And I think what this strain offers is it allows breweries that maybe don't have the capital to invest in a de-alkalizing system. They can, play around with the low alcohol market without that big capital investment. Cool lookies in Canada. Yeah, I'll post my email here too, and you can feel free to reach out. If you're interested in trialing this strain, currently it's available through Brewers Supply Group in 500 gram format. If you're an industrial brewer and need a different format, feel free to reach out to us. Jose, feel free to add any comments if you want. Thanks, Lucky. I guess Jose, I don't think your sound is working if you're trying. Another thing I'll point out, so SafBrew LA01 is just the first strain we're releasing for low and no alcohol beers. So hopefully we'll actually have some other strains available too, so we can add to the genetic diversity of that portfolio for to have some other options for producing low alcohol beers. I don't know what those strains will be yet, but the intent is to have some additional strains in that portfolio.
Brian, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, Jose.
Sorry about that. I was talking a couple of times, and I was like, seems that nobody can hear me, which was the case.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I saw a question, and somebody was asking, like, how popular is LA01 between Fermentis strains? And, I will say all depends with what you are comparing that strain for. Like, USO5 or Chico strain is the most popular in the whole portfolio. That being said, LA01 has proved to be very popular for non-alcohol beers. So when you're looking for microorganisms for a non-alcohol beer, like LA01 is like a go-to choice. And mainly for what Brian explained is through maltose and maltotriose negative microorganisms. And most of the options out there are just slower fermenters of maltose and maltotriose. So that's a big difference. Yeah. Pretty much what I had to say. Like, big customers that have tried, they love it, and like on my case, the big guys I work with, they can this, but then the can with the beer inside go through a flash pasteurization. I will say that the challenge of all the non-alcohol beers is to make a product shelf stable. There is, at least here in the US, huge liabilities if your cans or bottles explode on the shelf. So people are paying a lot of attention to that, figuring out how to ferment like through a through fermentation and an alcohol beer. But the biggest challenge is how to make it shelf stable for like at least 3 months over to a year if you go into distribution. So pasteurization is the key. Yeah.
Cool. Feel free to ask any other questions, or just say, I have a question, and I'll activate your microphone. Okay. Thanks, Tammy. Thanks for joining us. If there aren't any other questions, it looks like we only got a couple people with us still. But yeah, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up if there aren't any other questions. I appreciate you guys joining us. And Danshwar, I will figure out who covers your territory and put you in touch with them. So I should be able to get your contact info through the EduDip system. So
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Tammy. Have a good day, everybody. Feel free to reach out directly to us if you think of something in the future. So, thanks.
Thank you, Brian. Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.